All right, here we are. Common Sense, Ohio, June 11, 2025. The year is half done for those who are keeping track. Today, we got lots to cover, but let's hit the highlights. Not so quiet riots, as it turns out. Come on, feel the noise. It's catchy, too. It's spreading like COVID. Better ask RFK if he's going to come in and give us all a vaccine to stop it from spreading to your city. College or pro, what's the difference? NIL makes it big again. Turns out
Yeah.
we're going to pay the college players. Anyway, in Ohio makes it big again, at least in SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, and Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services. Guess what? It turns out discrimination is, in fact, discrimination.
Regardless of what you look like.
Who knew? Anyway, let's jump right into it. Fact of the day. This one's near and dear to my heart, guys, and maybe I'm a day off. I got to double check. But it turns out, I think on June 10, I am a day off. On June 10, but I just couldn't resist. In 1215, King John signs Magna Carta.
Wow.
And for those who don't know Magna Carta, it's sort of like the grandfather document of the modern political system, not the legal system. There's something else called the Assizes of Clarendon, which happened about 100 years before, but that did a lot of this stuff. But Magna Carta basically brought King John to his knees. King John was sort of an authoritarian dictator, but he was also sort of weak, I guess. Was fighting the French in the Battle of Bouvines, I think.
Yeah.
Or Bouvines.
Yeah.
Bouvin. And lost. The barons didn't like it at all, and they were rebelling against King John. They actually took London, and as a concession, King John had to basically give up a lot of the crown's authority. And every man, including the king, is subject to the law, and is often credited with the modern version of trial by jury, although there's some debate about that. It can go back further, like I said, to the Assizes of Clarendon. Our founders studied Magna Carta. Anybody who back in our era when we went to law school, we would have studied this in the first year, but now they don't. They teach some other nonsense. But this had huge influence on our Bill of Rights. This impacts how we look at federalism and states' rights versus the government and the power of the government, which is going to be an interesting topic as we talk about the riots. Like always, history tends to repeat itself, or at least we can learn a lot from history. So for those of you who think you know it all and you're 19 years old studying history and you're just learning a bunch of woke nonsense, study the good stuff.
Yeah, Magna Carta. Google that or DuckDuckGo it, and it's a fascinating bit of history.
You may learn a thing or two.
All
right, so let's jump right into it. These riots, as you look at it, it's sort of like COVID all over again. As you looked, I saw I can already see the montages of the conservative news media sources where they're quoting the other news sources saying mostly peaceful protests while there's cars burning in the background and looting and all this nonsense. So look, I'll let you talk, and then we'll talk about some of the implications on Trump's decision to bring in the National Guard, as well as his right to bring in the National Guard and what's going on.
Absolutely.
So anyway, what say you?
Well, the pretext of all of this was that ICE had arranged some targeted arrests of like a dozen gangbangers that were here illegally, rapists, murderers, drug dealers, whatever. And they went into LA so they didn't, do some kind of sweeping raids at Home Depot to round up people. They were targeted arrests. And then somehow, because there's probably a leak within ICE somewhere, somehow the protesters found out where they were going to be and surrounded the ICE guys and the people they arrested and started to interfere. And they put out a call for mutual aid to the LA sheriffs and the LAPD, and they would not show up. They did not show up. They did not lend mutual aid. And these federal law enforcement people barely got away with their lives. Like they damaged all these vehicles, and these guys had to basically run away from the protesters. And then that kicked off this meme with the politicians that this was some kind of huge illegal immigrant roundup. And it wasn't. It never was. But
even if it were,
that kicked off the riot.
So, and then you've got Newsom and what's the mayor of LA, but you've got them sort of complaining that the riots are caused by the federal response to begin. So you've got crime, meaning people are in the country unlawfully, and they're criminals in the country. So they're committing a crime while
Karen Bass, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that the mayor? Yeah.
And they're committing a crime while they're committing a crime, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, it's more than just what they think. And there are people interfering with the apprehension of that. So like it or not, even if you don't agree that you should deport unlawful immigrants or people who are here unlawfully,
Yeah.
you still can't hinder people enforcing a law. Now, this
Yeah.
isn't a new law. This is what's interesting to me. This is not new. It's just being enforced. And I guess over
Right.
decades now of California refusing to enforce it, you've got people entrenched into the community. And there are people on TV who are not citizens holding Mexican flags
Yeah.
and talking about overthrowing the government of the United States and rebuilding it with basically socialism. I've seen a couple of these interviews. I mean, they're talking,
Yeah. Yeah.
and this one guy's like, not the socialism of Cuba, not the socialism of what's the other one with Hugo Chavez, but
Yeah. Venezuela.
Venezuela, not that
Yeah.
socialism, but the good kind.
Yeah.
You
They
know,
talk about stolen land. Like these claims go back to the Mexican-American War and all this. I mean,
it's lunacy.
it's lunacy.
And so I think what we have now, and the reason it's catchy, I think, is because there are these people, these Marxists, who want to I mean, they're not shy about it. They want to fundamentally change the government. That wasn't their words. That was actually Obama's words. But we're going to we're going to fundamentally change the United States of America. Well, sorry, please don't. But I think what we have is whenever there's a cause like this, the professional rabble-rousers get out and they start instigating. And it's the same thing that happened during after the Floyd stuff, and the BLM riots that sort of spread throughout the cities, and people tolerate it. And I think Trump this time is saying, we're not going to tolerate this again. We're not going to deal with this again. We're just not going to do it. And it's not. You hear First Amendment people screaming their right to protest and their rights, but that's not what's going on here. And I can talk about a little bit of that.
Oh, yeah. So theorists like Steve and I. We've talked, on and off the air about like, why is there so much crazy stuff in our culture right now? Like these riots where you just have anarchy and there doesn't seem to be any, like they're just robbing stores there, which is totally unconnected to anything about illegal immigration. There's just anarchy on the streets. The cops are in one place trying to contain the riots. And then, gangbangers on the other side of LA just break into a Best Buy or something and steal, Apple phones or
they're looting.
Yeah, they're just so people wonder so why are we also pushing in our culture for crazy stuff like men playing in women's sports and all of this destabilization? And I think what Steve and I have I'm speaking for myself, but I think Steve would concur that basically what's trying to happen here is make Americans so afraid that society is collapsing that we elect a liberal, a radical strongman. And what blew up in the left's face is America did elect a strongman, but they elected Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so like this idea of undercutting society has blown up. Like I think the idea was to have a liberal administration. I think Biden's handlers tried this to some extent, where they opened the borders, where they did whatever they could do to undermine traditional America in order to place somebody like Bernie or somebody who's
AOC is next in line.
And this is just like Americans are not taking it.
And this guy who's talking about we want to instill socialism, not the Venezuelan kind, not the Cuban kind. And then you know what he said? I think he said sort of like the first 30 or 40 years of the Soviet Union. Yeah, like that worked.
Yeah, that was a great time.
That was a great time in history. Yeah. And as we always say, it's not like that killed 100 million people or so.
That's all.
Except it did.
Yeah.
That's all. And again, go study history. If you you see these idiots out there with their Mao Zedong shirts and the Chavez shirts and all this crap. Yeah. I mean, go study history. Go study what that's done. And what's interesting is when I always argue this with people, it's like, all right, I'll accept for a second that the person you put in charge to marshal in this utopian world.
Yeah,
I'll give you that you're okay. You can pick the right person who's going to be altruistic enough not to get not to succumb to the power. Not to get not to commit the violent acts that everybody else in that position has done.
Yeah.
We're going to give you that. But what about the next person? And,
right.
It's like you might. So let's say you get your utopia for like 10 years.
That's right.
And what about the next person? And, it's just, it doesn't work. It's never worked. It's not going to work. And as we talk about the Magna Carta, It was a rebellion against that, right? It was
Right.
the authoritarian
That's
rebellion.
right. That's
And these
right.
people sort of confuse this. Even people I know on Facebook are making these comments like this is fascist, Trump sending in these
Oh,
things.
for God's sakes.
But, we have people in our country who are actively, verbally, not citizens, advocating for its overthrow.
So
What is that?
yeah, so this is evidence of the huge hypocrisy, right? So anybody who was outraged, including me, including Steve, we know that bad things happened on J6, right? Like those people who were violent and who went into Nancy Pelosi's office and stuff like that, they had no business doing that. They had no business, and then there were other people who were like ushered into the building who were innocent. So it's a mixed bag. It comes down to exactly who you are and what you did on that day. But the people who claim that they're worried about attacks on law enforcement and they're worried about attacks on federal facilities, I would just say, look what's happening in LA, and they don't give a damn
No, they don't
about the attacks on
and
law
they're
enforcement.
blaming law enforcement for the attack. So this is like this.
It's huge
this is insane. I mean,
hypocrisy.
look, I do this for a living. I defend
We're
cases for a living.
consistent. We're consistent.
I have a case right now where a young lad was approached because of underage drinking or something, and he got scared and tried to run away and dropped his cup, and they charged him with resisting arrest, obstruction of official business, underage drinking, and the whole lot. So my defense when I go into court is if they would have just left him alone, Your Honor,
right,
this never would have happened.
Exactly,
This
right.
never would have happened.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen of the
Come
jury,
on.
it is the police enforcement's fault
Yeah.
for my client's criminal behavior. And that's what they're saying.
That's what they're saying.
That's what they're saying. So bringing in the National Guard is really the idea is to bring them in to establish stability, right? I mean,
Right.
so what you have is chaos. You have
Right.
people looting. There's no constitutional right to loot. There's no constitutional right to burn people's property, burn cars, burn houses, burn police departments, as was the case in Minnesota
Yeah.
back in the BLM
And
days.
if you were outraged by behavior on January 6th, then be consistent. You should be outraged about this.
Well, that's right. And now here's the argument, though.
I mean, come on.
They're not taking it on from that angle. The stuff
No,
I'm
it's all
reading,
political.
the stuff I'm reading is like, oh, this is rich. Trump, who called the January 6th guys patriots, now calls these people rioters. Look, if Trump could be wrong, and these people could still be right.
That's right.
Like both could be true, right?
That's right.
It doesn't. You don't condone this because you disagree with what Trump did for January 6th people. Both are wrong.
Right.
And
he
just
did,
shows.
by the way, and Trump did authorize up to 2,000 National Guard.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were declined.
And everybody's like, hey, Trump, why didn't you deploy the National Guard on J6? But they're against him deploying the National Guard here.
Right.
It's
just the hypocrisy.
It's situational ethics. Steve and I are consistent. Illegal behavior and violence is what it is, no matter what the politics are.
And I think it's important. I mean, even back in the days of the riots, when it hit your city, you had news people saying, there's actually the quote, I forget who said it, but where does it say that in the Constitution that protests had to be peaceful? Well, I mean, in the First Amendment, it says that.
Oh my gosh.
And so we do have a right to go out on the streets and protest. We do have that right.
Right.
But it's not without limits. And, you can't go out and shut down cities. You can't go out and burn cars. You can't go out and smash windows. You can't go out and loot restaurants and loot businesses and destroy other private citizens' property or commit violent acts. There's no First Amendment right for that.
They hailed those Waymo self-driving vehicles. They hailed them to the site of the riots so they could burn them down.
Yeah. So you can't justify that by saying, well, these people have just been so oppressed that, it's understandable. No. You don't get to do that.
No.
Because we still have a rule of law. We still have a system. We still have to play within the system. And those who would let that go for this are the true threats to democracy.
Right. Dropping.
You heard it here first. Well, maybe not first.
Well, and what I'm concerned about is on Saturday up in Cleveland, there was this Trump, anti-illegal, anti-roundup idea that ICE is going to come after illegal immigrants up in Cleveland. So, after George Floyd and some of these other events, these riots spread to other cities, and that has happened up in Chicago, Boston, New York City. Now the LA riots have triggered across the nation more stuff. And we had a riot here post George Floyd in Columbus.
Oh yeah, I did. I pondered.
Yeah, we're going to have one here, I bet.
We'll see. I mean, you live and learn. We'll see if the
We'll see.
cities tolerate it again. I mean, I don't think that they will. And that was a really weird time. It was shutdowns during COVID. I mean, it was
Yeah.
things are a tidbit different, or at least I hope so.
Now they're masking up for completely different reasons.
Yep. So what's this? What say you about college kids getting paid to play football?
Yeah, so a few stunning facts about this settlement that happened on Friday between signed off by a district court judge, federal judge. She signed off this settlement agreement between lawyers for the NC2A and the 5 big football conferences, and a class of 390,000 current and former college athletes. What it is, $2.8 billion will be paid to these current and former athletes, as a class, depending on what their actual market value is. So they've created a panel that will exist after this case is wound up into the future, that will, for big contracts like this $12 million they want to pay this high school kid up in Michigan to play for the Wolverines. Apparently, this panel will assess these big NIL contracts and decide whether it is actually market value. And they're going to spread this $2.8 billion settlement amongst those athletes. And then they're going to cap each team has a cap of $20.5 million. Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, whoever. They can't spend more on their NIL per team of $20.5 million for the whole team.
Well, you knew this was coming, right? Yeah. And look, there's a couple things that just you got to call out the lunacy when you hear it. Like, we're going to have somebody else tell us what is a market rate.
Yeah. There'll be lawsuits over that.
Isn't the idea that the market is what it is? So if somebody's willing to pay it, that is the market. But I get it. It's your way of creating a salary cap in college football, which is so insane. The salary cap used to be you get a scholarship. Unreal. Enjoy it, young man. And look, I remember my dad saying I was a kid, we're going to get to the spot eventually where they just pay these guys.
Yeah.
Because look,
and that's where we are.
And that's where we are. And look, I'm not necessarily opposed to it because of the money that's getting made, or of the money that the colleges and universities are making on the backs of these kids.
Yeah, I get it. You take a guy like JT Barrett, Steve.
Yeah.
So he didn't really have an NFL career, right? But he was captain and quarterback for the Buckeyes for 4 years.
Yeah.
Right. And then meanwhile, the the athletic department's making hundreds of millions of dollars off of him. And you would say to him, hey, spread it around. I'm sure his lawyers are going to make a hell of a case that he ought to get a chunk.
Yeah. And look, maybe he should, maybe he shouldn't. I don't know about applying it back. We'll see. But anyway, that's it was the natural, I think, progression of NIL to begin with. And, I personally worked on cases for kids who were accused of wrongdoing, taking money or taking gifts or taking whatever.
Yeah.
And
now they would be.
It's sort of like those who used to grow pot in Ohio.
It sort of was like betting on baseball.
Sort of like betting on baseball. The times change.
Now it's cool.
But that brings up a bigger picture. When what is it about things that have changed like that, and what is it about our society that's changed? Are we better or are we worse as a result of this? And we could probably go down a rabbit hole, which we're not going to do. But I will at least ask the question.
Yeah.
Are we better or worse? Are we better because we've made it legal to now grow and use marijuana, generally speaking? And what was the cause of the prohibitions to begin with? There's a give and take, and there's always a consequence for these things. Are we better now that we can bet in bars and on our phones and gamble? Because these are sins, right? I mean, quote sins. I mean,
right there at the baseball stadiums, they have betting kiosks on site.
And is our society better? And by sin, I mean, these were considered to be like taboo type behaviors. You know?
Right.
And why? Why was that? And I think there's probably a little bit of thought that should go into that. Like, why did we think it was bad to have ubiquitous gambling or gambling? Anybody could gamble and bet whenever they wanted. Why was that bad?
Yeah.
And why was it bad that we didn't have?
I think the big one was on drinking and gambling is that daddy's going to spend that after work, right? Go home to his family and they're going to get kicked out of the tenement.
Right. So we called these things illegal. And now they're legal. And time will tell what that does to our society, because there was always the push by those who wanted to engage in that behavior to make it lawful. That's funny because I have a buddy who used to be an assistant United States attorney I was representing somebody who was buying, selling marijuana, and the AUSA heard me outside the courtroom one time talking to my client who was saying, "Man, this crap should just be illegal." And the AUSA came up, and we had resolved the case by then, so it wasn't like he was talking out of turn. He goes, "Here's the problem, man. If it were legal, you wouldn't have made any money. You know, you engaged in this black market business, buying and selling marijuana, and the only way you could do it is because it was illegal.
Yeah.
And once you make it legal, you can't make any money. So that was the big push by those guys. They justified it any way they could because they were making money.
True. Once we got rid of prohibition, what was Al Capone going?
That's right. So we created, and that's the other side of it. We created basically
Al Capone.
We empowered the mob.
And
entrenched the mob into our society, I think.
Yeah, all those
I'm no pro on this.
Bathtub gin that killed people.
Yeah, we created that.
Yeah,
by simply making alcohol unconstitutional or making it alcohol legal. So I don't know. We'll see.
With the best of intentions, but it blew up.
It blew up, right? So we shall see.
We shall see.
We'll see what the college kids do.
Let's talk about that epic Supreme Court decision. In some ways it was predictable, but after the Harvard-Yale decision, it's kind of predictable that the Supreme Court would get rid of another skin color test.
Yeah.
In the case of Ames versus the Ohio Department of Youth Services. So, Steve, I think you looked into this a little bit. Tell us about Title VII.
So in 1964, we passed something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that created a Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Basically, did something I think it was more revolutionary or more significant than we now know. We've been swimming in this water for a long time, but it basically reached into private employment and said you can't discriminate. And we've all grown up with this, so we take it as gospel, and it's just how it is.
Yeah.
But it's actually a big deal to say the federal government can tell us who I can hire and who I can't hire, whether it's discriminatory or not. I mean, there's an argument to be made against Title VII in this context that says, look, if I am backwards enough and stupid enough to not consider hiring or employing people just because of the way they look or who they sleep with or what their skin color is, then my business should fail eventually. The market should fix that because you're smart enough to say, well, that's stupid because there's this whole group of people, this pool of candidates you're not considering.
Right.
Dummy.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, that's the argument against
two restaurants. One says whites only and the other doesn't care what your color is. Well, you're not going to go into the whites only one. You're not going to give that guy money.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I tell this story. I probably told it on the show before, but Thomas Sowell has this example of government discrimination versus private discrimination. There was a government law that basically says the buses, you give only white people on buses or whatever it would be.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if the government runs the bus route, so if it's like COTA, it turns out that those laws were strictly enforced, the segregation laws. So black people couldn't ride on the bus for white people or whatever the exact law was. It doesn't matter for this this study. But if in the South, another city where it's the same law, but the public transport is private, guess what happened? Nobody enforced the law because the private entities running the bus route were saying, well, this is stupid. I'm not going to cruise around all day on an empty bus. I'm going to pick up whoever wants to get in the bus and pay me to take a ride. And you
force your driver to become the police.
That's right. And they're saying this is stupid. I'm not going to do that. So the owners of the private bus routes were saying eventually those laws became unenforceable because the private people wouldn't follow them. Now, that's not to say they were good laws. I'm not saying that, but it's to say how do you enforce it? Yeah. And what, these aren't good concepts. So, and here's the left does this, and these people like these writers will do this. They'll take this out of context and say, now you're advocating for segregation.
Yeah.
No, right. I'm not.
Yeah.
It's bad.
Sure.
What I'm advocating, we have the same belief that it's bad. What the discussion should be is how do we enforce it? And should we enforce it, or will it fix itself on some level in some way? And how much tinkering is necessary by the government? Because there might be some.
Right.
And I think what we're talking about in Title VII is the federal government saying, look, employers, you can't hire or fire or make employment-related decisions, promote based on, back in the day, it was sort of color, race, sex, religion, and national origin. And in 1976, there was a case called McDonald versus Santa Fe Trail Transportation Company. The Supreme Court held that prohibits, so this is back to 76.
Yeah.
Title VII also prohibits discrimination against members of either a minority group or of a majority group. And then in 2020, we took it a step further, and the Ohio Supreme Court, or the U.S. Supreme Court, said in Bostick versus Clayton County, Supreme Court held discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation qualifies as prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex. That's when they sort of made it so
Yeah.
it applies to homosexuals or gays. So what developed from this was this weird process, Title VII. And what if I believe I've been discriminated against? And by the way, Title VII doesn't apply to everybody. So if you're a small business, it doesn't work. You have to have so many employees at bigger companies. So a small mom and pop, no. There might be state laws or other things that would
Oh,
apply,
yeah. Right.
but not Title VII. But it created sort of this burden shifting approach where I say I wasn't hired because I'm black. And then there's a couple of things I could do to try to establish that. And one would be because this company has never hired a black person, so a statistical
Right.
type of analysis. Another is you can show a disparate impact
Yeah.
based on say the company has a policy in place
Yeah.
that says we only hire from Upper Arlington, Ohio, where there are hardly any minorities anyway.
Yeah.
So by impact, that is clearly a
Right.
discriminatory. So things like that. And then if I make that prima facie showing, then the burden shifts to the company to defend itself and say,
Yeah.
nuh-uh.
Yeah.
And what emerged out of all this was this standard at play in this new case. And
Yeah, and just to get the interesting facts, Steve. So I looked into like why she was complaining. So she was originally hired as a secretary at the Department of Youth Services. They promoted her to a program manager. Okay.
Mhm.
She then wanted to have a supervisory, she wanted a promotion. They denied her the promotion and gave it to a lesbian applicant who was, she argued, she wants to argue, and I guess she now will get her trial, that she was less qualified than the person complaining here. And then after she made that move and was smacked down, it sounds like the Department of Youth Services then acted to demote her, and they put her back from program manager back to being a secretary, which is where she started like a decade and a half ago, and gave her old position to a gay gentleman.
Right.
And so those are the facts, and she wants to argue in court that she was
Right. So
discriminated against.
And in order to do this, there was a test for years. This is like the statistical stuff. And so the summary, the district court granted summary judgment in favor of the defendant, in favor of the employer, applying the background circumstances test, under which Ames had to show either a statistical evidence that her employer discriminated against the majority group. So statistically, you never hire majorities. So it's like we talked about. Or
just her versus just her case.
Just she could show that the decision was made by a minority group. So one or the other. So what are the particular unique background circumstances here? Is there statistical evidence that shows you never hire majorities, or you could show that minorities own the company and that gives you enough.
Yeah.
So look, here's the problem with this. I don't necessarily agree with any of this anyway. So, if you think about this,
she wants the same standard to apply to her.
That's right.
As would apply to anybody else. And they created a higher standard for her because she's white.
Yeah. Or a different standard. And
it was a higher standard.
The problem is I don't like any of the standards. I like as a sort of a libertarian, I find all this stuff sort of questionable because you start tinkering with the private, you've got to check the levers of power. So for instance, and we'll get back.
And this is pretty like 2019 is when these things happened.
Yeah. So for instance, and I've used this analogy upstairs in my law practice not debating, but arguing or discussing with people. Should the government be able to tell me that I have to represent, or let's say I have a practice because I'm a no good, rotten, white supremacist, sheet wearing KKK guy. I don't represent anybody of color. Anybody who's not a good old fashioned red blooded American citizen, I don't represent you because I'm a no good, rotten idiot.
Yeah.
Should the government be able to tell me that's against the law? I, that it's a dicey problem
I
because
got you.
it's sort of like baking the cake in Colorado.
I got
At
you.
any rate, the standard is what it is.
It's akin to free speech, who you hire, in a way.
You can't govern thought.
But
You can't.
this is a government agency
But
of the state of Ohio.
Well, it's the state actor, and we're doing it anyway.
Yeah.
So the standard applies, which is a good point. So is a state action.
Yeah.
And now we've got this problem where you have different standards for the majority. So
Based on what you look like.
Based on
This
what you
is a
look like.
thing I can't get around. So if I present myself to the court and say I'm being discriminated against, if I have dark skin, it's a different standard. So the Supreme Court 9-0 threw that concept out. Now it's the same standard for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're white or black or Hispanic or Chinese. Doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman, gay or straight. That was the point of this decision. And it was the radical justice Brown Jackson that wrote this opinion. So
yeah, and it's unanimous,
pretty
right? So
unanimous.
There are different decisions on how far you should go with it and what the application is. But look, I think there was this. It's funny how little attention this got. In the media, but it was a unanimous court.
Yeah, Ketanji Brown Jackson, like no conservative justice there. She wrote this opinion.
Yeah.
So
because on its face, it's stupid.
It is. Yes.
You can't discriminate. If you can't discriminate, then guess what? You can't discriminate.
So what Clarence Thomas and Gorsuch said in their concurring opinions is this bolsters that Harvard-Yale decision. And going back to Alan Bakke case against having quotas, and the other cases Steve just cited, is that we want a merit-based society. That's what they were saying. And Ketanji doesn't want to quite go there in her opinion. But obviously, the concurring justices are saying, look, you should just, like Martin Luther King said, content and character, look at merit. That's what you decide, hire fire on.
Yeah. And this comes on the heels of Students of Fair Admissions versus Harvard, the 2023 case. U.S. Supreme Court strikes down race-based affirmative action in higher education. Ames, basically, it's pretty clear the court is opening up the doors.
Yes.
No pun intended, to lawsuits.
Race blind.
And you can't, this is like, and anybody who watches and all my content that I create everywhere, they know that I always try to take these things and I reverse them and I apply them to the other side. And I've been saying this about these discrimination laws forever. It's like, look, be careful what you ask for because you're going to get it the opposite way. You can't, you can't have it both ways. And then what happens is the other side tries to redefine the terms. Well, it's not discrimination, Norm, because you're not historically discriminated against, so it can't be discrimination. And you think you're scratching your head. It's like, well, wait a minute, that's not what we said when we wrote this. So,
well, and I always go to the logical end game, which is, how do you determine race anyway? Are you going to have racial courts? So you take our former president Obama, who, I'm just talking about the facts of his origins. He had a black father and a white mother. Okay. So is he white or is he black? And I would say, I don't care. My assessment of him, if I were to hire Barack Obama, would not be based on whether he's white or black. But people are obsessed with this.
Yeah.
And it's the Supreme Court is saying, we got to let this go.
Well, it's because at its bottom, it's reduced to absurdity.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
And who's going to determine which race he is? It's ridiculous. Who cares?
Yeah, you're going to eventually get to the spot where somebody looks white, but they're black, or looks black, but they're really white, or whatever it is. Or you get these people like, what was her name? Elizabeth Warren claiming that she's Native American because she has one whatever. And
you know, the Nazis tried this shit. I don't think we need to go down this road.
That's right, because you end up in that kind of scenario.
That's where you end up.
What are you genetically? We're going to have genetic testing based on, and you have certain privileges based on this. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can't have a melting pot.
You had to show so many generations of Jew-free grandparenting, like back, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 generations in order to be a member of the Nazi party. Is that what we want to do here? I don't want to do that.
No. Look, we are a melting pot and we all become one thing.
Yeah.
Americans.
So, goodness. Well, it's a hell of a case, and I'm glad we're going that direction because it protects everybody equally. And we do have an equal protection clause in our Constitution. It's nice to see that we'll now be treated equally, regardless of our race, including mine. Um, so, Steve, interesting bankruptcy situation with this firm 23andMe. There are now 26 state AGs that want to block this bankruptcy auction of their DNA data involving 15 million Americans. And of course, each of those Americans, by extension, their family members' DNA is out there. So it might be more like 150 million Americans' DNA data up for sale without the permission of these people, because they want to say it's an asset of the bankrupt 23andMe company.
Well, look, I mean,
Wow.
there's lots of, it's very fascinating. This idea that you can go submit your DNA to some company and they're going to give you all sorts of fascinating information about your lineage, your heritage, who you are. And I mean, I've been tempted, but I know better.
Swab your cheek and mail it in.
But I know better, because I don't want people having my DNA. And why? I don't do anything wrong.
No.
I don't commit crime, but there's something about it. It's like something about it. I don't like it. And, wasn't I think the murder case out in Idaho or whatever that is, that was sort of the impetus of all that was
Well, you told us here on the show about this brilliant attorney up in Michigan where there are like false DNA results can get you arrested in some cases.
It can't,
or even charged with a murder. And you're because depending on how intensely that DNA test is done.
Well, so here's what
I forget the guy's name, that attorney.
It's something a little bit different. I mean, I'm working on a case right now where what's happened with DNA testing is this. So on the criminal forensic side, DNA testing has become so sensitive. And by sensitive, I mean we can now detect previously completely undetectable amounts of DNA and then test them. I guess we can, before you could detect them, but there was not enough to test.
Yeah.
So what we do now, and I'm butchering the science, so you chemists out there and biologists, forgive me.
Yeah. You're condensing
Dr.
a lot
Kessis,
of stuff.
my expert, forgive me. But what they do is they cycle up the sample. And anybody if that term rings familiar, it's exactly what we did for COVID testing. We would create these PCR tests where you would cycle up the amount of DNA. So if you replicate a trace amount of DNA, in theory, you can cycle it up based on a model.
Okay.
And make it enough to test.
Oh wow!
But it's like anybody who's done any if you've ever built a house, and like the first 3 feet of your corner foundation is off by just 1/8 of an inch.
Yeah.
But if you take that out, to 100 feet, now you're off by 1/8 of an inch times whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like 6 feet off at the end.
Yeah.
So the point is they're not all that reliable.
Okay.
But the other problem is the other problem with that is how that almost undetectable amount of DNA got there. And there's a case out in, I think, California that was sort of famous. There was a murder case, and under the guy's fingernails in the murder case or somehow in the body, they found DNA that matched a homeless guy, and they charge or they're going to arrest the homeless guy and accuse him of murder. But it turns out they found this guy, his lawyers fortunately had experts get involved, and they ran this down. And it turns out that a medic who worked on the homeless guy also worked on the deceased murder victim.
There you go. Yeah.
And that was the only connection, because it turns out the homeless guy was like in a different stratosphere at the time. Like he had a solid concrete alibi. So they're like, wait a minute, how can this happen?
And the chain of custody on a 23andMe. So like I send in a swab out of my mouth, but how does 23andMe know that was really me?
Well, but the government solves crimes with these things. So look, I always said,
the Zodiac killer in California.
I'm not like, those of you who thought that was all private or you didn't care. Well, buyer beware. I mean, I was telling people at the time, don't think, well, they promise it's never going to get released. Right. It's like, well, then it started to get released.
Right.
And now it's going to get sold to who knows.
Yeah.
So look, it won't be long before the government has all of our DNA. It just won't be long, but I'm going to resist as long as I can.
Well, and also it's kind of akin to this facial recognition software where like there's been false arrests.
Mm-hmm.
People, and I always say, well, what about identical twins? One's a murderer and the other is a, Catholic nun, and they both go to the airport. Well, you're going to arrest the nun because she looks identical to her sister. I mean, to me, it's not enough. It's not enough information to arrest somebody. But if you're after a terrorist that might be blowing up a nuclear device, you're going to step on people's constitutional rights
Eventually, yeah,
all day
eventually.
long.
So it's an interesting
Yeah.
it's an interesting philosophical debate, but it's happening.
Um, so a couple things. Let's talk about some fun things. So, on social media, Elon Musk went nuts, and so did Simone Biles.
Mm.
Over two completely different situations. Like Musk is ticked about the big beautiful bill, and Steve and I have problems with that bill too. Like, and so do like fiscal conservatives everywhere. Do not like the idea that we're going to add trillions to the debt, and we're not going to do the Doge cuts to the extent that we want. And we're not cutting any social programs at all, like Medicaid and Social Security. They're just as big and fat as they always were. So I get it, Elon. I get that you're disappointed and you spent 4 months pissing into the wind. But he posted, like, he said Trump should be impeached and JD Vance should become president, and that Trump was partying with Jeffrey Epstein. Like, he went nuts. And now he's deleted all that and apologized. And Simone, in a different thing, she took on Riley Gaines out of nowhere and said, Riley, pick on somebody your own size, because Riley's this big, tall, kind of broad-shouldered swimmer, NC2A championship swimmer. And Simone's this, the world's greatest gymnast by all accounts. Like, she won more gold medals than any gymnast in history. And, she's petite and tiny and all that. And so she's kind of fat shaming, or I don't know,
I
body
don't know
shaming.
what she was saying. It was a little bit
crazy. And now she's apologizing. It just goes to show you, be careful of what the hell you post.
well.
Right?
It just is so. I mean, the Musk and Trump thing. I think we actually predicted it here at the table. It's like eventually,
Steve, you in particular predicted it. Steve is on tape, people, saying that the week that they appointed Elon, Steve said, well, how long can this last?
yeah, this is going to go bad.
You said it.
Yeah.
I mean, Steve, I'll give him total credit.
Yeah.
He said it.
I mean, you got two huge egos. It's like they can stay on the same page only so long. And
Yeah.
Elon comes from the private sector where he can just buy Twitter and go in and just start hatching
and
people.
be a dictator. Like, he can just tell you, oh, I want that fender on the Cybertruck redesigned, and I want it done now.
I don't care how much it costs.
Yeah.
Just do it.
And you can't do that in government.
Or when he takes over Twitter, he starts asking, what's your job? You don't know. Bye-bye. It's like, so
let this sink in. When he walked in the lobby with that kitchen sink.
Yeah. So, and he was great for this Doge exercise, I think, for that reason.
Yeah.
But look, I don't like the big, beautiful bill for all sorts of reasons. But the idea of not having the big, beautiful bill is worse. Look, I choose every day in my law practice with people. I help them all the time.
Yeah.
If you're accused of something and you've got two crappy options, here's what I always say. All right, we can choose crappy or crappier.
Yeah.
Which one do you want?
Right.
Because you don't get a third choice.
Yeah.
And we had crappy or crappier. The third choice was nuclear. No bill at all.
Yeah. And we lose all those Trump tax cuts from all those years ago,
which
our taxes go up 68% in some cases.
Which people say is an immediate recession and all sorts of problems. And I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they say. And, so I can easily see how Musk would look at this bill and say, this is stupid. We haven't cut any spending.
Yeah.
It's the same nonsense over and over again.
And
I can see how Rand Paul is saying the same thing.
We're growing our debt.
Yeah.
And in fact, like, it does the opposite,
It was sort of like when Biden said inflation is going down because it's not going up as fast as it was yesterday. It's like, it's so stupid, but the other choice was we have no big, beautiful bill and the tax cuts come in, or the tax cuts expire and we've got chaos,
Yeah.
And then I think worse is, like, the other thing Musk doesn't understand is sort of the politics of it. Like, we're running a government, not a business.
That's right.
And you've got representatives from sort of half and half states sitting on the Republican side saying, look, I can't take this home in my state, folks. I won't get reelected.
Right.
That's worse.
Right.
We have to, like, if you want a conservative movement, which I think is what we're pushing for, it's not necessarily a Republican movement, but a conservative movement.
Conservative.
This is as close as we got to take incremental steps.
And I think they only have like a 6. I mean, it's amazing what Mike Johnson, that he even got this bill through.
It really is
with
sort of
a
testament.
A 6-person majority in the House. It's like, it's unbelievable.
And remember, Trump never purported to be a spendthrift, right? I mean, he was
no, he spent a lot of money during COVID.
He
I
was,
mean, he piled it on. We're going to do this. What was it?
and
Operation Shockwave or whatever.
yeah,
We're going to come up with a vaccine. It turns out that was a
that
disaster.
was a disaster. And look, and even I think to some extent, we interviewed him here. Vance is into some government
Oh
spending and
yeah. Oh
programs and
yeah.
such. So
I mean, from his background, right?
yeah,
In a way, those government safety nets saved his family.
hmm
And so at the retail, where the rubber meets the road, if you are destitute, which is, like he had two irresponsible parents, and his grandparents were the ones who basically saved his life. And, they were scraping. They were getting Meals on Wheels. Grandma was splitting her lunch with him
yeah,
so that he and his sister could eat the free meals coming to the house. I mean, so when you grow up in that kind of situation, Appalachian poor, you start to you appreciate those programs.
yeah. So look, I mean, and so Trump never purported to be the fiscal
No,
conservative.
no,
Now,
no.
notwithstanding Doge coming in, which I think was part of the reason for the conflict I
It was.
foresaw. Is like,
Yeah, yeah,
listen,
yeah,
because it made like Trump can see that as a business. Say, look, this is stupid. We're spending all this money
yeah,
on dumb stuff, and he could get on board with Elon for that.
yeah.
But then
Like
Elon's
USAID stuff,
yes,
right?
and look, anybody on the other side, just because it's Trump and you're disagreeing with this, you're wrong.
Yeah,
It's like because anybody looking at the practicalities of some of these programs would have to say this is stupid.
they're
It's
absurd.
the proverbial $1,000 hammer in the army. It's like
Right.
get rid of that crap.
And Democrats used to say when things were stupid like this that it's stupid. And I don't know what's happened to the party, but there were blue dog conservatives who would be against a lot of these programs.
Well, the problem is that I mean, is it Trump derangement syndrome? Because it's Trump, we
Yeah,
disagree.
right.
It's like,
Immediate knee-jerk
and
reactions.
you could say like if this were reversed and there were a KK, for instance, with the riots, if it were a
Right.
KKK riot in Columbus, Ohio,
Oh yeah.
and Biden sent in the National Guard,
Yeah, no problem.
nobody would complain,
No. Uh-uh.
including
Including me.
me. Right? I wouldn't complain either.
No.
It just revert. Like I always try to reverse it.
Yeah.
Take the lever of power, take what's going on, and reverse it, and take the politics out of it.
Exactly.
It makes perfect sense. So if Newsom is not doing anything about this, and innocent normal people can't go to work,
Yeah.
something's got to be done.
And the only rational Democrat out on the national scene now is John Fetterman. Like he's the only guy saying those riots are outrageous, and
We
he
gotta
should
stop it.
send in the National Guard.
Right, and he should.
Yeah,
He
I
should.
mean, good for Senator Fetterman, who we used to think he was like out of his mind. It turns out he's the most rational Democrat in the Senate.
Well, and to some extent, the other side is egging and all. They're egging it on. They're setting up a no-win scenario for Trump. What they're doing is nothing.
Yeah,
Letting this happen.
yeah,
And then sort of daring Trump in the background to do something about it, and then
Right.
complain that he's a dictator for doing something about it.
yeah. Like the optics in Chicago during the
Right.
Democrat National Convention,
Same
when
thing.
Mayor
Right.
Daley sent in the cops and they roughed up a lot of the hippies, and
Like-
now they're the bad guys.
They're the bad guys for. So look, it's unfortunate. This could have been stopped at the outset, and I guess there's a back to the riots again. So we got off track, but
Yeah,
my understanding is from, and I don't know if this is true, but Homan has been saying this. Look, we have tried to cooperate with the court system and the jail system in LA or in these sanctuary cities,
yeah.
so we can go in and do this sort of
Nice
quietly,
and quietly,
peacefully.
right?
You've got people in jail who are criminals and
Right.
they're illegals, so we're just going to go grab them there. And
Right.
instead, you're not letting us in,
Yeah.
so we have to do it on the streets.
Like the lady judge up in Wisconsin.
That's like that, right?
Now,
Now,
they
and-
tried to arrest a guy after the hearing, nice and peacefully, and the judge lets him out the back door.
And the one thing Elon did say,
I mean,
and has said, is that look, what is, you have to sort of ask rhetorically again, and we've asked this before, like what is the like what's the goal?
Yeah.
Like, why are you letting all these people into the country?
yeah,
I mean, you can't just say it wasn't happening, because it was happening.
yeah,
And then what's the goal?
you're right.
And at least express it. Are you saying, well, look, we need to work, we need a labor force? All right, well then let's give them green cards so they can work. Like,
That's right.
But what's,
Temporary worker permit.
yeah, let's do something.
Yeah.
But they never would state the goal.
No.
So Musk would say, well, the goal is so they can have more votes and they can keep power and they can have a one-sided system.
Right. Right.
And I'm not saying that it was thought out that far, but it sort of looks that way. And
When we
with a
had
certain lens.
when we had candidate Marino in here, remember I asked him that question, and he didn't think it was about voters. He looked at me like, no. I mean, they wouldn't let people in because they are hoping they're going to be Democrat voters. And I'm like, Bernie,
Well, maybe they wouldn't let people in because they're hoping. I think there are people letting people in because they subscribe to a list of things that you're supposed to ascribe to
Yeah.
when you're on
Well,
that
it
side.
does create that constituency.
It
Even if
does.
they're
Yeah.
not voting, those are people that you're gonna extend healthcare to and
That's right.
school,
Right. So
educate.
then if
Yeah,
they're going to vote to keep it.
yeah.
Right.
Once they get the vote
Right.
at some
So
point.
look, it is what it is. The bottom line is it looks like the Musk Trump the war is coming to an end.
Steve, can I ask you, this is an open-ended thing, so you could do this short or long, but this Ohio you remember that case involving the family that was murdered down in Southeast Ohio?
Mhm.
A big famous case, and DeWine and the attorney general got involved, and they prosecuted and found these
Down in
people
Pike County.
down in Pike County. What was the name of the family?
I'm drawing a blank,
Yeah,
but
I'm
I'll
drawing
look
a
it up.
but at any rate, the state of Ohio now is saying that the judge who heard that case made some material mistakes during sentencing, and they want to reopen the sentences of the people who were found guilty of murder in that case. Now, that's pretty darn rare. That's kinda like that LA thing on the 2 Menendez brothers, right? So what's
Maybe.
that all about that you why would the state of Ohio try to reopen the sentencing?
All right, so this happens sometimes. All right, so it was the Pike County murders back in April 21, 22 of 2016. 8 members of the Roden family were shot and killed in their
That's it,
homes,
Rodin.
4 separate locations. Murders were execution style involving 32 gunshot wounds. 2 years later, the Wagner family, a local family of 4, were arrested and charged with the crimes, and it had to do with like a custody dispute. I mean,
And
and so
convicted and sentenced and
they were all, I think now the convictions are all done and sentenced. So what happens is Ohio has something called sentencing factors and considerations. They're set forth in 2951 of the Ohio Revised Code. And you can imagine what they might be, things you're supposed to do and say at a sentencing hearing. So if the judge is, for instance, going to impose consecutive sentences, you got 2 crimes, they're going to make them back to back, or in the vernacular of the street slang would be run them wild. So you got
yeah,
8 on this, 8 on that, consecutive meaning 16, or concurrent meaning only 8. So the judge they have to make certain findings on the record to support that. And the findings might be something like this is a more serious version of this crime. So no murder is alike, but there are some that are worse than others. We know them when we see them, or risks of recidivism, or what's the likelihood, and rather of doing it again, of somebody committing another crime. The need to protect the public from this kind of crime. What's the economic harm? What's the harm to the victim? Those
all
kind
of
of
these things,
these
huh?
are all sort of factors. And I don't know what the exact problem with the Roden or the Wagner sentencings were, but my guess is the judge didn't say some magic words that he needed to say
Okay,
in order to justify the sentence, meaning uh, the defendants can appeal. You have a right to appeal a sentence and
okay,
have it reviewed. And
okay.
if the judge didn't do something right,
And the state has the right to
I,
appeal the
I
sentence?
don't know if the state has the right
Because
to.
that's kinda double
I don't know
jeopardy,
if the
isn't it?
state has appealed it or if they're just requesting a resentencing hearing. I don't know.
Okay, I think that's what they're doing, the latter thing,
They might be requesting a
a
resentencing hearing,
resentencing hearing.
and they can sometimes do that in order to avoid an appellate problem. Maybe that's what's going on.
This is pretty rare,
But
right?
maybe not as rare as
No?
you think. Usually, what happens on these kind of things is sometimes the judge will just bring back my defendant and say, "I forgot to say something on the record. We're going to
Oh,
come back and say it."
okay.
And there's some problems with that because not
Yeah,
double jeopardy necessarily, but in theory, once the sentencing is over and the entry is filed,
yeah.
under law, the state court, the county court loses jurisdiction over the case,
Okay.
and the inmate becomes the custodian of the state of Ohio, not the county.
Because it's over.
But there's certain circumstances where they can do that. So usually, what happens is they reconvene, have a separate sentencing hearing or another sentencing hearing, say whatever they were supposed to say, and make the findings they were supposed to find,
Okay.
and then off again for the same sentence.
From what I've been reading, the state, is saying that this judge made some kinds of big mistakes, and what I don't get about this is why didn't they object in real time instead of letting these people go to prison and having that first sentence imposed? I guess they maybe preserved their right to object, and now they are?
All right, so maybe the state's appealing this because they didn't impose life without parole, but instead, so the state of Ohio is looking for a harsher sentence for Jake Wagner, the Pike County man who admitted his role in one of the state's most complex murder cases. Um,
I just never heard of this before. But you're
okay, so
saying
here's what happens: the
okay,
prosecutor and defense both agreed that when Wagner pled guilty, he would serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, however, sentenced Wagner to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 32 years after being newly assigned to the case. So Judge Jonathan Hine is also overseeing the case against Billy Wagner. So I think what happened is there was a joint recommendation presented to the judge. The judge didn't follow the joint
Oh,
recommendation. So,
and he
look,
doesn't have to, right? I mean, a judge has a lot of discretion, right?
I have never. No, yeah, the judge does not have to follow the thing. So I don't know. You caught me a little bit flat-footed. I'll have to
I'm
do some
sorry,
research, and I'll do some research and figure it out. We can talk about it next time.
Okay. Hey,
Some
outrage and
some good and bad. Let's do
yeah.
it.
So my outrage of the week is this. I mean, we keep having this happen in Columbus and Cleveland. I heard of a stabbing in Cincinnati with police. So we've had here in the central Ohio area a little township called Mifflin Township,
Hmm.
and two policemen were shot by a 21-year-old who was given a sweetheart deal on a previous gun crime back in 2023. So pretty recently, he had one of those fully automatic Glock switches installed on this Glock. And that, according to what I've read from the FOP, that's supposed to be like a flat 6 years in prison. And he was given probation. And now he's out on the street, has a gun again. He's a passenger in a car that gets stopped for a traffic infraction, gets out of the car, turns around and shoots at these two cops and puts them both in the hospital. One very seriously after several surgeries. So I find that outrageous. They found him. The SWAT team here in Columbus found him at an apartment. He let three kids out of the apartment he was holed up in, and then he did a self-inflicted shot, and he's still alive, but not before he shot at the SWAT team. So this guy, I mean, he's clearly something's wrong with him, but he's shooting at cops, and I would just think, if I had a fully automatic, I don't know, a World War II souvenir, believe me, the ATF and the Columbus police would be putting me in prison, and for some reason, this guy didn't go. So I find that outrageous.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything outrageous this week. It'll just be a spillover from the last time I was on the show. I talked about the Upper Arlington graduation where, for whatever reason, the school decided not to have the military boys and girls stand up and be
Yeah,
recognized.
that's outrageous.
Didn't do anything to recognize Memorial Day and the
Yeah.
fallen, the folks who fell in battle in defense of our country and on Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah,
But
that's
that led to
crazy.
a good.
Yeah.
So here's what happened.
But the girl who did well in the science fair was fine. They
Mhm.
acknowledge her.
Yeah,
Let's all
both.
clap for her.
Yeah, both.
But do both.
So there's some good news that came out of it. Believe it or not, my wife went to the school board meeting
Yeah, she should.
and
Yeah.
made a public comment about this to the school board.
Yeah, like what's wrong with you?
And
Come on.
and and afterwards, I think it maybe 3 out of the 5, not because the other 2 wouldn't,
Yeah.
but at least 3 out of the 5 found her
And
before
said,
she got out the door,
yeah.
gave her a hug and said, "Look, we're sorry. We're gonna
Yeah.
look into this."
That was
So
it was a goof.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so
And thoughtlessness. Yeah.
and I guess the hats off to my lovely wife
God bless her.
for doing it because I didn't think of it.
I'll tell you what, parents at school board meetings are getting to be a thing.
It's sort of, it reminds me
You know.
of the old who was the Washington or the Saturday Evening Post, Norman Rockwell.
Okay. Yeah.
He has these 4 pictures or these 4 famous paintings, like the Freedoms,
Yeah.
and one is the guy standing up in the town hall, sort of delivering a speech, and it's
Yeah.
like the freedom of speech. It's sort of, it's like that's what the school boards are becoming.
Yes, it is.
Um,
Your classic like New England town hall.
Yeah.
Like, hey,
Yeah.
I want to say something. My winner of the week here is Attorney General of the US, Pam Bondi, who she has made lemonade out of lemons here. So they're bringing back that crazy Maryland dad, the nice Garcia guy. And she went and had a grand jury indict him on like 100 counts of human trafficking, 100 separate trips he made, sexual imposition, and even possibly conspiracy in the murder of a rival
that's
gang's
awesome.
mother.
Like, welcome home.
Welcome home. You're going to prison. And I guess Senator Van Hollen can go have a margarita with him in a
Yeah.
federal prison. He
Oh,
doesn't
I'm
have
sure
to go
he'll be
to
on the preferred visitation list, I am sure. Well, look, with that, we're going to wrap it up. That's awesome. With that, we're going to wrap it up. We have Common Sense Ohio, June 11, 2025, brought to you, by the way, by Harper Plus Accounting. My accountant could be yours. Our accountant could be yours, not just to count the beans, but to also help you strategize, grow your business, make complex business decisions, and get your taxes filled out properly. By the way, I'm working on a case up in Michigan with some folks who got all sideways about how they were keeping the books and what they were doing because they didn't have Harper Plus. I promise you, you won't go sideways if you've got Harbor Plus on your side. This is Common Sense Ohio coming at you right from the middle. Till next week.